Yeah. So let's start with questions because we're gonna be diving in today. I had thought mistakenly because I looked too quickly at the at the materials. I had thought that we were going to be taking another return because the way that I've structured this is that we cycle back and fill in with a bigger picture. So I thought we were going back to Genesis today, but that's not quite right. It's so today we actually look with a little bit closer at the New Testament. And then in a few weeks we arrive, more fully at Jesus. And but let's start with there were a few things that I wanted to say that I meant to clear up from last time when I listened back to the class. Let's see. I think I mentioned to you last week when I saw you, that the dating the Jewish strife in the region, that I had said, I kind of alluded to the idea that that after the temple it was, that the temple was like the main thing, but that was really the end of the Jewish war. That wasn't the end of strife for Jewish people in the region. I did mention it does go on, but I needed to sort of emphasize that while the Jewish people were still in the land, things were destroyed after the Jerusalem in 70 AD, but people were still in the land and strife continued until about 135-ish. And Masada was one of the last big stands. And the cannibalism thing was actually, I think I mentioned also that it was I misattributed that. That was attributed to occasions in the Jewish war rather than Masada. Masada was actually a case of mass suicide, although apparently some scholars have wondered about the accuracy of that. But
why did they commit suicide?
Because they were walled up in a fortress and surrounded on all sides, and they were starving, and they didn't want to become slaves to the Romans. They didn't want anything, so they made pacts. Although it was illegal for people to commit suicide according to the Jewish law, so they had arrangements to sort of kill each other. It was like suicide by another person. You've heard of like suicide by cop, like you draw on a cop because you want them to shoot you. So it's that same sort of idea, and they basically just sort of starved them out. The Romans sort of starved them out. There was a lot of but it was sort of the last stand of people who did not want to give in to Rome. But that was, and then after that, basically, Jewish people were essentially expelled from the region, and so that starts the diaspora that I mentioned. I also wanted to clarify because I mentioned the Mishnah and the Talmud and those texts. I mentioned that those texts are later texts, but they have their origins in Second Temple Judaism, and the idea is the oral Torah. It's like commentary on, exposition on, and clarification of the study of and clarification of points that from the written Torah, right? And so the oral Torah that then started to get written down in the Talmud, part of which is the Mishnah. And so for Jewish people, those texts are as central to Judaism. They are sacred texts in the same way that for Christians, the New Testament is integral to the Bible, right? So it's not just the Jewish Bible in the Tanakh, and then all other texts are distinct, second or tertiary texts. The Talmudic literature is really central as well, in the same way that the New Testament works for Christians. Let's see. So, and those were actually written down rather than just discussed and debated in the Common Era. They were written down later. And John asked a question that I didn't really get a chance to answer all the way. Or no, that's not true. I sort of failed to answer it. Probably had the chance, but I just got distracted. And he asked about purgatory, because we were talking about hell and heaven, and I mentioned that Sheol is actually, though it's translated hell, that's actually the place everybody goes, and according to the earlier segments of the Bible. But and that heaven is really kind of off limits for people for the most part. people can't go there. That's really for spiritual beings. He asked about purgatory, and what's interesting is that in spite of the sort of bifurcation that we see of like heaven and hell for the good and the bad and whatever, the picture that's really interesting is that it sounds weird to say, it's like, well, everybody goes to the place that's translated hell. Nobody goes there. Like, that sounds really like, what? Compared to what we're used to. But there are interesting phrases in there, like, he asked about purgatory. Jesus makes a comment. He says, everybody will be subject to the fire. So, which is very interesting, because there's an idea called, there's an idea in the Bible, God is referred to as the refiner's fire. Right, you probably heard that phrase before, maybe in some song literature. God is the refiner's fire, and the refiner's fire idea is that in coming into any kind of proximity, or like the idea running through the Old Testament, and especially in like the Exodus story, people approach the mountain, or people approach the Ark of the Covenant, or people, are unprepared in some way, shape, or form. The presence of God is just, you're dead. Like it's, so there's something, it's something we can't handle. And when they talk about the refiner's fire, it's really this idea that the presence of God, or the reality of God is such that if it doesn't destroy you outright, you will be purified by it. In the same way, because a refiner is like for metals, you put a piece of metal in, and it burns off what's called dross, right? It burns off all the impurities in the metal, and metal workers then take it out and shape it or pound it out, and then they put it back in, and it cleans it further, takes it out. And now, what I like to say is, if you were a piece of metal and you were going to be subject to something like that, you would hope that there's more to you than just rust. You know what I mean? And so there's this persistent idea that the presence of God the reality and the presence of God is so overpowering, and is so unyielding, but like in a good way. It's like, just persistently kind, persistently loving, persistently this, people who are just like unwilling to be cruel, you know what I mean? That kind of thing. God is so good. God is so like honest. And that's the other thing. If you want a glimpse of this, think about standing up on a rooftop and shouting all of your worst behavior. You know what I mean? Be honest, be truthful, being subject to truth, or having visited upon you the entire web of every poor choice you've ever made. I cut some guy off in traffic, but I was in a hurry. Then that guy cut somebody off. That guy treated a barista poorly, and then that barista has a drinking problem and they beat their wife, or you know what I mean? Like the web of all of our interactions visited on you. That being subject to complete truth, what would that be? So and so Jesus then says, like, everybody will be subject to the fire. In the same way that in Revelation, because she was talking about apocalyptic literature today, there's this idea of being called to account for all things. The book of judgment, the this, the that, the judgment day. There is this idea that one way or the other, we all will be subject to some kind of 100% truth, 100% honest evaluation of ourselves. And sometimes that's pictured as being subjected to fire, a refiner's fire. The idea is that we come out the other end of it better, more, and so his question about purgatory is that purgatory as a concept is actually there throughout. It's there throughout, but it was sort of pictured as this limbo space between heaven and hell. And that's kind of a medieval sort of picture. Again, it doesn't really exactly map onto, in the same way neither does heaven or hell, map on exactly to a biblical picture of it, but it's all kind of in there. It's all in there. These ideas, they just aren't quite how they've been presented to us sometimes in the past. But so that's where we get this kind of purgatory ideas. The idea of purgatory is purgation, right? So that's where the refinement comes in.
But don't they believe though that others are going to pray their souls to heaven? Like, 'cause my girlfriend's like, she's Catholic, and
Yeah, yeah.
they're very Catholic,
Mhm.
and that's their thing. Is you got to be.
Mhm.
They pray like unceasing for their loved one who's passed. Like they
Yeah.
believe
Mhm.
that their prayers are going to help this person get out of,
The
get to
purgatory
heaven.
and
Yeah. That is definitely part and parcel of it, but even that, like, whether or not we would say, like,
I just
as
wonder where
a,
they got that idea. Where did they?
well, this is, yeah, that was just gonna say, part of this is, whether or not we would say that that is a fairly accurate blueprint for how things are structured, or whether we go, actually, I don't know really how it's structured. What that does harken back to is something that is in there, and that is the way that Jesus talked about the dead, the living, the awake, and the asleep. Because he would speak about people who were clearly dead, as though they were alive. He would talk about people who were dead as though they were asleep. And he would talk about people who were clearly alive as though they were dead.
I'm
So when he
confused.
says, what's that?
That confused me.
Well, it's
I mean,
very confusing.
The last thing you said.
He would talk about people who were clearly alive in the world right now as though they were dead. He would talk about people who were dead, like in front of you dead, as though they were asleep. And he would talk about people who were clearly dead, like historical figures, as though they were alive. So he talked about Abraham, and he spoke about Abraham in terms as though Abraham was alive. He talks about Jairus' daughter. He says, "Behold, she is not dead, but sleeping, but she was clearly dead."
Or who was she?
The girl that Jesus raised, her father is named. His name is Jairus, and he says she's not dead, but sleeping.
That's
And-
different than Lazarus?
And Lazarus also, for he has gone to sleep, right? Clearly dead for 4 days. And in fact, in Jewish tradition, 3 days was given as like, this is the spirit is the spirit and everything, the spirit soul, that's gone after 3 days. They even gave it a little bit of time, like they're totally not recoverable. And so Jesus deliberately went to Lazarus' tomb slowly so that it will have been 4 days. And then he raised him from the dead. And then he tells the guy, he says to somebody, I don't think it's the wealthy merchant, he says to somebody else who asks to follow him, he says, "But let me bury my father first." And Jesus says, "Let the dead bury the dead." So he's talking about people who are alive, let them bury your father. You have other, if you really want to follow me, let's rock and roll. And so it's very, you can tell John that if he wants a more involved answer to his question, it's in the first minutes of this. But when he's talking about people who are clearly alive, let them bury the dead, a dead person, but he's calling the people who are alive dead. And so there's this question of exactly what constitutes the being of a person being alive in any metaphysical sense that goes beyond the physical sense of dead or alive. And so there it's a very, very interesting, if you know that he's got this really unusual paradigm of dead, alive, awake, asleep going on, then sometimes when you look through the Bible, you go, there it is again. You see it crop up. It's very interesting. And it shouldn't strike us as that weird, because whether our current version that we've inherited is correct or not, we still do have this idea of something enduring after death, right? So it's a little bit like saying, one scholar has suggested the possibility that the serpent is a misreading of the word, and that it actually is an angelic being that when he's, struck down to crawl on his belly, is actually a sort of angelic being that is essentially being heavily demoted, like wings being clipped, as it were. And and people would go, that's ridiculous. And then they'll also, on the other hand, go, but clearly the serpent was Satan. You're like, why is that so radically, you know what I'm saying? So like when I bring up this paradigm that Jesus spoke in, it's not so far removed from how we already talk about the departed, you know what I mean? About the soul and the spirit and what endures, what doesn't endure, and whatever. We already kind of have this 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 sort of little lexicon for speaking about this sort of stuff. The question is, how much does it match what we hear in the Bible? And something like it is there for sure. And so it's very interesting. I think Jesus' paradigm about the awake, the dead, the sleeping, the alive is really interesting to watch out for when you're reading, particularly the New Testament. But speaking of which, let's jump in with that. Any other questions before we move into the New Testament? So the first thing is, do we know what gospel? Let's look at the weekly research minute. Do we know what the word gospel means? It's Greek for good news. So the word gospel is Greek for good news. Now, synoptic is an interesting word, and it's worth knowing because it's worth knowing something about these four. How many? We have 4 gospels, but we have 5 narratives. Do we know what the 5th one is? Acts. Because the author of Luke also wrote Acts, and Acts is the Acts of the Apostles. So it's what happened after, like the end of Luke, and in the first generation of the early church, after Jesus' death and resurrection. Well, what did they do then? That's what's in Acts. So it's the Acts of the Apostles. So now, sticking just with the 4 Gospels, we have this word that I can't write until I switch. There we go. I'm gonna shut this door. It's noisy. So the word synoptic. Does anybody know what that word means? So let's break it apart. Anybody know what the second word means? Visual. Yeah. You go to the optometrist, right? Sin, like sympathy, sometimes you see it with an M, sometimes you see it with an N. Sympathy is sympathos. Sorry, sympathos. Feeling with, or feeling together, right? Toger? What? Together. There we go. Okay. So pathos. So optic, seen together. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have really similar timelines, really similar stories, really similar just takes on the whole thing. John is real different. It's real weird. It's very wooga wooga. It's highly spiritualized. It's got the highest Christology, by which I mean the understanding of Jesus as a messianic figure is really pronounced in John. It's the most pronounced in terms of its spirituality. It has a different order of events, and it has sometimes very different stories. So, for example, the synoptics will have, like the synoptics may have the Last Supper, but the Last Supper is sort of there in John, but the feet washing thing you may have heard about, that's only in John. The actual Last Supper, the supper portion, is not in John. That's only in the synoptics. John has different miracles. The wedding at Cana, where the waters turned to wine, is only in John, right? The number of visits to Jerusalem, different, earlier in John than in the synoptics. Synoptics, so they're called the synoptics because they have so much in common in order of events, in chronology, and many of the events themselves, and so they're grouped, and they're called the synoptics as opposed to John. But the synoptics also have an interesting thing. If you glance briefly at the last page that I gave you, what you'll see is what some of this is debatable, but generally speaking, Mark is felt to be the first written of the Gospels that we have. It's the first written, and Matthew and Luke show signs of having used Mark. So that's why there's a lot in common with Mark. Matthew and Luke also have stuff that is non-Markan literature that they seem to share. there is a hypothesized source that they share that the German scholars who came up with it, just the word source in German is Quelle, so they call it Q for short. The Q document that, may have been used by Mark and Luke. And in some cases, these are just verbatim, things. Some people don't believe there was a Q. Some people think that Luke used Mark. Luke admits right out of the gate, he's like, a lot of things have been written, so there's clearly stuff we don't have anymore. And John also says at the end of his gospel that a lot of things have been written and could be written and will be written or whatever, but that we, many of these things we don't have anymore. Luke admits he pulled together sources. And so some people think maybe he just used Matthew, that there's a lot of thought that Matthew and Luke kind of came about at the same time, so that maybe they had a shared source. Some people think Luke came later and may have used Matthew. So you can kind of look at that as a sort of general guide. Q may or may not have existed, but certainly there were multiple sources being shared and used at the time. Matthew, the actual disciple, these are attributions, the authors. These are attributions. They're not actually named. The authors of the Gospels are not actually named. But early church history suggests that Mark was a disciple of Peter and wrote down Peter's anecdotes about Jesus. But one source says he didn't put them in any particular order. Matthew, attributed to Matthew, but almost certainly not by Matthew, may be a composite work. There was attributed to the actual disciple Matthew an early Hebrew gospel that continued in use, and there are multiple attestations to the existence of this gospel, but for a variety of reasons it kind of fell out. There are some people who think that there are traces of this gospel in the Gospels we have, possibly Luke, since he compiled things. So it may not be altogether lost, but we would only see it in part in Greek in the Gospel of Luke. And John was, the problem is there are a lot of Johns. We don't know whether it's John the Elder, John the Presbyter, John of Patmos, John the Disciple, son of Zebedee. And the question, are these all the same people with different names depending on who gave them the nickname? Or is this all the same person? Or are there two Johns with different names, 3, 4? But there is a John that was older, known to have been very old, known to have had authority, and they pressed him to write something down. And so this is where we get the book of John, presumably. So what do we find in there? In the stories, there are only 2 birth narratives. There are only 2 nativity stories, and they are in Matthew and Luke. Mark starts at Jesus' baptism. After the birth narratives, there is a mostly absent youth. We know that he spent time in Egypt. Jesus spent time in Egypt with the family. We don't know how long. There's a story about him he's back in Jerusalem by the time he's 12, and at the temple for some festival. And that's the only youth story we have. We run into Jesus later when he's probably around 30 and starting his ministry, baptized by John the Baptist, who is his cousin and who is he seems to maybe have some ties to a group called the Essenes, but he seems to have been doing kind of his own thing. But he has things in common with them. Yes?
I saw some program about the Bible, and it showed that in Jesus' lost years, like you're saying, he went to India. And
yeah, there are rumors about things like that. Mm-hmm.
And he was, he spoke and shared ministries with a higher Indian somebody. There
are a lot of different stories about where, like, the question is always like, where did Jesus get this information? There seems to be similarities to things like Zoroastrianism in there. So maybe he spent some time in Persia, or maybe whatever. So there are even stories about him going to like England and learning from the Druids.
I heard that too.
Yeah, it's
that was in the program.
People are always trying to fill in the stories. I want no, it's okay.
It had something to do with the Buddha. It was like a Buddha person that was sort of related to.
There are a lot of questions. There are a lot of things
Jesus.
about how similar there are things between Christianity and Buddhism too. Yeah. There's one of the things that I've wondered personally is, because we know that he spent time in Egypt, is I've wondered a little bit how much time he spent in Egypt and how much early education he got in Egypt, because there was a Jewish contingent in Egypt at the time. And not very long after this, we get people, major figures like Philo of Alexandria, really distinct thinkers. And what's interesting is I've wondered a little bit about what the effect on a Jewish person in exile from the land, how would that affect them when they came back into the land and saw different sects operating? Because I see a very big ecumenical push from Jesus, where he's like, he doesn't seem to be as interested in sectarian Judaism as he is in something more, like what we would call mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis's book. What do we all have in common? What are the most fundamental things? I see that big time in Jesus's ministry, and I wonder if I've wondered a little bit if the influence of his youth of being somebody, a Jew in some kind of exile, maybe, but we know that he was, we have a story of him being back in the temple by the time he was 12, but these things can make a dent. But the truth, the fundamental answer to that is we have no idea. So, but he's baptized by John the Baptist, appears to continue in that religious tradition, because he goes on and has his own baptism campaign in tandem with John the Baptist before John's death by Herod Antipas. He goes after his baptism into the desert and is tested by Satan, and he has those three visions. Another thing in common with Buddha. Buddha sat under the tree and had 3 temptations, so he has that testing in the desert. This is part of the reason people wonder this stuff, is because they see parallels like that.
Oh, the threes.
The threes, and then after this temptation in the desert, where he passes through these temptations, everything else, he begins his ministry proper. Some of this ministry is, like I said, a baptism ministry, and he gathers disciples, 12 of them, and the 12 is believed to represent the ostensible leaders, or to be representative of the 12 tribes. Right? So there are 12 disciples, there are 12 tribes of Israel. There is a lot of talk about the lost sheep of Israel. And at some point we may discuss, I have some thoughts about how this symbolism of the 12 tribes, and even the symbolism of communion, of the Eucharist, harkens to the question of how priesthood functions. But we can get into that more. But it's right there already in the beginning with 12 people meant to represent tribes.
So each disciple, they were the head, or they were a member of one of the 12 tribes?
That I don't think we know. I don't think we know that, but I do think, well, so for example, the Levites were not allotted a portion of land. When they came back from Egypt, the Levites didn't get a portion of land. The Levites were dispersed among the tribes. Mm-hmm. So you didn't have to have a priest from that tribe. You had a Levite, and they lived in your land and whatever. So I don't know that it was necessary that these people, while they represented that there are 12 tribes, I don't think it was necessary that they be from those tribes, because the Levites weren't from those tribes either. Okay. But because I think that I think that there is, in some serious way, a symbolism about a new priesthood.
I know the way I look on a lot of those things is that this stuff, a lot of it was written down by people long after it happened, and they wanted there to be symmetry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You don't really know if there were 12 tribes, or if there were 12 apostles. There might have been more.
Right.
But,
well, there were definitely more disciples, and this is one of the reasons that I would suggest that the 12 is actually a historical memory, because we know for sure there are a lot more disciples, but the very early prominence of the 12 is pretty early. It's fairly consistent.
Okay. Yeah.
And so we think that there were 12 selected close disciples and apostles. the words are sometimes used interchangeably. But we know that there are as many as 70 wider disciples within, like, in fairly frequent communication with them. And then there were, dozens and dozens beyond that of people who just kind of like, oh, he's coming to town. We like him. He's neat.
Gossips.
Yeah, there you go. Gossips. But so we know that there are, so for example, that John the Elder, you're like, okay, or is it John the Elder because he's one of the disciples who's super duper old? Or is John the Elder one of the Johns who was among, it's often asked, is the John that we're talking about, John of Patmos or any of these Johns, if he wasn't John, son of Zebedee, is it possible that he was one of the 70? Because this crew all kind of, in some ways they kind of coalesced into the early church in Jerusalem, many of them. So anyway, there is a transfiguration moment that is, in some ways, I think slightly, I don't think we give quite enough credit to. There's one person has made some observations about how it works in relation to God's apparent defeat of the Egyptian gods in the Exodus, the defeat of Bile, some of the Canaanite gods during the time of the prophets. And in this case, they think that the Transfiguration actually represents another one of those, like, God triumphant over other gods. So there's some interesting stuff going on at the Transfiguration when Jesus is transfigured on the mountain, and they go like, whoa, look at him, he's all shiny, and that's cool. But there's also an interesting moment, because people have sometimes said, and I'll just throw this out there now, people have sometimes said that the Gospels demonstrate a belief in an early eschaton, which is the end times, the sort of fulfillment of all God's plan, right? And they use and there is evidence of that throughout the New Testament. But one spot that they use is when Jesus said, "Behold, there are some of you here now, some among you now will not taste death before seeing the coming of the kingdom." I think it's interesting that the very next thing that happens is, hey, come on in.
Hi.
The very next thing that happens is the Transfiguration, which is into a sort of like, it's a glimpse of the kingdom. So, and he has disciples with him, the people he was talking to. So I actually think that the Transfiguration actually is, sometimes they go, yeah, Jesus was shiny for a minute. I think there are a couple more things. I think there's some more stuff going on there. So there's the Transfiguration, and then of course we have his final week, and one of the trips, if not the only, certainly one of the trips, the fatal trip into Jerusalem, where his popularity and some of the symbolism of the things that he does gets him on the wrong side of the authorities. And the word passion, does anybody know what the word passion means? From the Latin passio? Why do I keep going?
Love?
What's that?
Love?
No, it actually means suffering.
Suffering.
Yeah. So this is why people go, oh, he's so passionate. But look at the face of a passionate man, like some passionate singer. He's always like, it's always followed by somebody going, I will die if I cannot have you. It's suffering, right? It's never like, things are great when you're here, and also when you're not.
So it's with a lot of feeling.
It's a lot, it's not just a lot of feeling, it's specifically suffering, and so this is why it's the passion of the Christ. It's not just the feelings, it's not like, it's not just love and adoration, it's actually suffering, and that's why passion in the sense of romantic passion, it's almost overwhelming, right? This is where we get the word compassion, like sim, meaning together. Compassion also means, alongside or with. So you're suffering with the person, right? Compassion. So then, following his death and his burial, the ever famous Easter moment where he goes, ta-da, and he comes back, and everybody's one of the things that I think is really worth remembering, because so many people will be like, well, I mean, we know that people don't go back from the dead now. And people talk as though people back then, like, well, they believed in dying and rising gods. Well, like, yeah, but like in Osiris and whatever else, and they were all stories. People back then, and N.T. Wright makes this observation, which I think is invaluable. There's something called the you're giving particular deference and to modern people as though we're somehow better. And he said that's really inappropriate, because people back then knew just as well as they know today that the dead don't just like get up and walk around. That's why this story, like if you read it, they're like, what? Like this is totally unexpected. It freaks them out. And it's not just like, oh, he came back from the dead, people do that. It's not the story at all. The whole point is that this was completely earth-shattering. This was wildly unexpected. This is not a thing that's supposed to happen. But when they looked at his ministry, when they looked at the things that he said, they go, he told us this would happen, and it went because we just thought, well, he must mean something symbolic, because clearly people, well, it'll become clear to us in time, I guess. And he comes back from the dead, and they're like, so like for real? okay. Now what do we do with this? And that's so it's exactly as shocking then as it would be as it is to us today. And so we need to we need to keep that in mind when we're reading it. And then I know you have to go. The Gospel of John, highest Christology compared to the Synoptics, and a different order of events. And then the Acts of the Apostles has the continuing story, and we'll go from there. But
I'll read your notes the next one.
Cool. So anyway, in the Acts of the Apostles, you have a little bit of kind of the word denouement. You have a little bit of kind of the come down from the story of the resurrection, and you have the ascension. You have Jesus going, okay, I'm taking off, but you'll get the Holy Spirit here in a bit, and you guys go out and do your thing, and love each other, tell the world, blah, blah, blah. And then the ascension, and then Pentecost happens. And Pentecost is the arrival of the Holy Spirit to the Jerusalem church, and the members of it, and they, the disciples as they're gathered in Jerusalem, and it really becomes this, that's when it kind of becomes a movement to go out into the world. That's the tongues of the flaming tongues and the speaking in tongues, and then a little bit later we're introduced to Saul, the first martyr, who I don't have this down, but the first martyr, the first person to die for this besides Jesus himself, is Stephen. They have after Judas's betrayal and after Judas's betrayal, they have to get a 12th. They need another person, and Stephen is chosen. And Stephen dies. He's put to death, and he has a vision while he's dying, and he sort of expounds on it in this beautiful kind of sermon as he's dying. But he's put to death. But one of the people in attendance is a man named Saul, who is a very like fervent, zealous. I think he's a Pharisee, and he sets about kind of tracking down, like really going after the early Christians, because he thinks they're dangerous. He thinks they're a radical sect. He thinks they're weird, and it's just desperately anti everything that he thinks is right. And so he sets about going after them. And he then has an experience where he encounters Jesus in a vision that throws him off his horse and blinds him for a few days. The people that are with him hear something, but they don't see it. And it sounds distinct. It sounds kind of distinct, but it's important to remember that even in the resurrection appearances, on the one hand, they can touch him. They can even see the wounds. He can eat, but he also is not stopped by locked doors. And he's there in a moment, and then suddenly isn't there. And then he walks with them for miles and is unrecognizable until something changes. They do something, and they go, it's him, and they recognize Jesus. So this, in the resurrection appearances, there's already some question as to exactly what the nature is. It's both physical, apparently physical in a way, but also does not seem to follow physical rules. So it's already weird and strange. But the appearance for Paul is a visual and an auditory experience that while they hear it, the other people don't see it that are riding with. I think there are a couple people with him. He's thrown from his horse. He's blinded for a few days. He seeks out another follower of Jesus, probably among the 70 or something. He's not one of the disciples, but he seeks out I believe he's an older. It's Ananias or Ananias, Ananias or Ananias. I think that's right. Anyway, and he cares for Saul, and he helps him back, and then Saul's sight comes back, and he goes. He says there's some differences between Acts. There are some differences between Acts. Acts basically starts with the early church and then becomes all about Paul. We learn a ton about Paul in Acts. Largely, it's believed because Luke was a sometime traveling companion of Paul. So it makes sense that Luke, as an author, would chronicle some of that time. So the latter half of Acts is really largely about Paul's ministry. Paul, he goes largely by Paul after, but it's generally thought that Shaul was his Hebrew name and Paulus was his Romanized name, because he was from Tarsus, which is probably in Turkey, but he was a Jewish person who made his way into Judea and to study under Gamaliel, I believe. So we see Pentecost, we see Paul's conversion, we see the adoption of new apostles, we see the martyrdom of Stephen, and we see the dissemination of the gospel out into, people going out into how it begins to spread. It fairly quickly becomes a Gentile religion. Paul, it's not really talked about, but Paul says in his letters that he went to Arabia. To just deal with this revelation that he had, to just manage it and try to make sense of it. And then when he comes back, he meets with the heads of the Jerusalem church, which are Peter, and actually prominence is given to James, the brother of Jesus. And so James is the head of the church. There is some question as to what exactly the wording means, because adelphos could mean brother, it could also mean like cousin, family member, male family member, so it could be cousins. So it's not 100%, people go back and forth on it, but we do know that Jesus, like it says in there, is, Jesus, are these not the brothers of the mother and the brothers and sisters of Jesus, right? So and the brothers are named and sisters is plural. So either these are very close-knit family, or these are actual brothers and sisters. But James is given leadership in the church. He's not one of the original 12, but he's given leadership in the Jerusalem church, and Peter is there as well. And Paul has to present himself to them for some kind of because they're like, isn't this the guy who was hunting us down? He has to present himself to them and defer to them, and he requests that while the rest of them are kind of going out to the lost sheep of Israel, to anybody from previous diasporas, whether it's the Assyrian one or whether it's the Babylonian one from those times, he says, I want to go to the Gentiles. Is that cool? And they go, what are you going to tell them? And he sort of lays out, makes his case, and they say, okay, all right, yeah, you guys can do that. Their mind isn't really on the Gentiles right now. And so when Paul comes in and says that, he's really doing so. He's like, I want to go to the Gentiles. They're like, all right, whatever. But this quickly turns into a really important and early problem, and it's in the New Testament. This is not a post-New Testament thing. right there in the letters of Paul and even in Acts and these things. They go, well, it's revisited. Like, what are you telling the Gentiles? Do you have to? They're like, are you telling them they don't need to be circumcised? Are you telling them what they need to eat? What they're like, well, what are you telling them? Are you saying we need to become Jewish, or can they be Gentile and do they have to become Jewish? And they're like, well, I mean, you got to do this. And they're like, well, I don't think you need to do that. And there's this big question of what are called the Judaizers. So there are people, and there's some strife. Paul seems to butt heads with them. Paul wants to reach out. He sees this as a mission that is bigger than just Judaism. And he doesn't want to wait for that. He wants to go now. And they are still kind of working on a gathering in, as it were. And for them, it's intricately tied in with being Jewish. But there's a lot of immediate strife as to what exactly is necessary. And one of the things, just from my own perspective, one of the great sort of losses is that when the Jerusalem church, when we had the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and certainly by the diaspora the diaspora in 135 AD, the Jerusalem church just kind of goes away, and at best, like, there are some question as to whether or not they became what we would call the Ebionites. Some other terms were the Nazarites. We don't know if they're exactly identical. Some of them almost certainly got absorbed into other churches. But what we do know is that Paul, compared to the early Jewish Christianity, and they wouldn't have had many homes within Judaism. Increasingly, the Jewish people, the synagogues, didn't really want Christians hanging out. They would worship alongside in the early years. Paul, anytime he went anywhere traveling, and he traveled a lot, he went to synagogues first. He went to his fellow Jews first, and things were kind of okay. They just saw them as, well, they're another sect. They follow this Jesus rabbi and whatever else. But not long after that, and certainly after the destruction of Jerusalem, Jewish people were not keen on having Christians. That was an increasingly Gentile movement. They were not keen on having any affiliation. And so there was not really a place for a Jerusalem church to go among their fellow Jews where they could still be Jewish Christians. And so either they maintained some kind of small movement of theirs, which didn't last terribly long, like the Ebionites or Nazarites, or they got absorbed into what was increasingly Pauline Christianity. And they just, so one of the things that we kind of have lost is a strong sense of exactly what early Jewish Christianity looked like. Some glimpses can be found in looking at, things to do with the Ebionites and Nazarites. Also, Syriac Christianity was pretty, we think that had strong ties to early Jewish Christianity. So if you look at the Didache is not canonical, it's not in the Bible, but we do know that it is a very early Christian instruction manual. It was a very early Christian teaching manual that was used in probably the Syriac churches just a little north of where you would have had, Jewish Christian movements.
Who keeps that Didache?
It's totally available. You can get it online.
Oh.
Yeah, the Didache, it was discovered and found and translated and dated and everything, and we know that it was used. It's very interesting, the Didache.
How do you spell that?
D-I-D. And it's called, so the word Didache means the teaching. And so, and there are, one of the things that's interesting, and we'll talk about more, is non-canonical descriptions of early Christianity. The Didache is one of them. It's not in the Bible, but it definitely tells you, like, we are Christians and here's what we do. And this is probably from around 100 AD. So this is very early. If you were wanting to date it, it's probably within decades, within a very, 1-2 decades of when the Gospel of John itself was written. So, it's really early. And it's very much in line with most of what we see throughout the New Testament. Now, there are some things that people would go, well, that's not quite what I'm used to. So there's a different There's different language around the Eucharist. There's different language around communion, but communion is central, so that's in there. There are, there's the interesting ways are the interesting thing. One of the interesting things about it is the ways in which you see similar language between like the Didache and some of the teaching like of Jesus himself and stuff like that with really early stuff. When you're watching for it, you can see some of these these changes, things getting more spiritual, less practical, some things getting more orderly, less I'm trying to think. I don't want to be too.
Who wrote it?
It was just a thing that was drafted up in the early church for instruction of new
Google
congregants.
says it's anonymous.
Yeah, it's just it has no distinct author, but it was just drafted up by people for instruction of new congregants and new initiates into the faith. I think there are a handful of things that I think should be like, they're non-canonical, but people should know them. People should read them. There are some things that didn't quite make the cut, but were in very widespread use early on. But some of the things that did make the cut almost didn't. The Revelation almost didn't make it. Even the Gospel of John was considered for not being in the canon. Was considered for not being in the New Testament.
They said that there was writings of Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, those are pretty late and almost certainly not. Yeah, there were a lot of things that were pseudonymous, that were written in the name of so-and-so. It wasn't considered quite, I mean, it was and it wasn't. It was more common to write things that we would consider forgeries these days, but it was also not quite as forbidden. A lot of things were considered pseudonymous, and they were written in the name of either, let's say, if I had a teacher and then I wrote down what my teacher said and I just ascribed it to him. And people say, he wrote this? You go, no, he didn't write it. So it's pseudonymous, or people wrote things down that they thought probably in good faith, this is representative of our teacher or of their teacher or of a person or whatever. And there are a lot of texts that were floating around, but the number of texts that were floating around started to grow, and sometimes how you date them can tell you how seriously you should take it. Gospel of Mary Magdalene is not an enormously reliable text. However, one thing that you can say about even the weirdest of these texts is you can look at them and go, well, this is what some group of people who used this text, what they believe. So it can tell you something about some of the traditions, but some of them are late, some of them are real weird, and some of them, and you can kind of get a feel for them the more time you spend with them. We've found troves of them now. There are bunches of them. But again, some of them start to take on a little bit of the aspect of like fan fiction. You're like, well, this is clearly just nonsense. And I read this really interesting book recently, and somebody said by contrast with a lot of these later gospels or later whatever, some of them, he goes, the gospels that are in the Bible, the ones that made the cut, are in many cases kind of arresting and very, engaging and have a lot of spiritual fruit in them for you to digest. He goes, and then you get to some and you pick them up and you're looking at them and you're like, it's just tedious and they have none of the like immediacy or whatever. It's just like some weird, boring stuff that has, that people, it's like reading like if you're totally not into Dungeons and Dragons and then you read like an essay written by somebody who's way too into it, they're like, it kind of reads like that. So it's very, you can kind of get a sense of them when you look at them. You go like, oh, okay, this is one of those. But the other thing is that people like to make a big deal and they're like, these are forbidden gospels and these are not whatever. And my dad made an interesting point one time when I was asking about them years ago, and he was like, they were like, these are, the church hides these and the church whatever, blah, blah, blah. And we really, they've tried to put these, he's like, you can get them from the library. It's not hard. You can, and now, I mean, you can Google them in a snap. You can totally find them. The Nag Hammadi Library is a group that was uncovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, and they're very early Gnostic texts that fall into some of these categories. Some of them are real bizarre and just meh. Some things that they found are very, very interesting. Some things, we do occasionally find something and we go, this does seem really like.
Did you say that the apostles were written by Luke?
That what? Sorry. The what?
Acts.
Acts is written by Luke.
Yeah,
Many
okay.
people treat it
That's
as
what
just
I thought.
a single text, Luke Acts.
Okay.
Yeah. And the earliest things that we have in the New Testament are Paul's letters. 7 of them are considered 100% authentic. Like 7 of them are agreed upon by scholars to for sure be by Paul. Another 3, I think, because I think there are 13 letters attributed to Paul. Another 3 are somewhat debated as to whether or not they're by Paul or whether they may be by somebody in a sort of a Pauline school, Pauline school of thought among his disciples, but we're not sure. And then there are 3 that most people agree. I think they're the pastoral epistles. A lot of people really think probably not by Paul. They showed too many differences with other things Paul said, too many differences in writing style and things like that. Although there are people, perfectly respectable scholars, like I'm a fan of a guy named Luke Timothy Johnson, and he's a Pauline specialist. He's one of the rare ones, but he makes an okay case for it, I think, that the questions of style around these have a lot to do with understanding rhetorical trends of the time, and he thinks that all of them are written by Paul. Hebrews was Hebrews was for a long time attributed to Paul, but is now largely thought it doesn't have an obvious author. Paul tends to say, I, Paul, wrote this, or this is, but Hebrews doesn't have that. So some people think that most people now think Hebrews is not by him. The reason it was attributed to Paul early on likely was because people didn't know who wrote it. Although I did read somebody recently say that it's possible that it was by Paul, but in a sort of circuitous way, we kind of lost track of it. But, these are things that scholars go back and forth on a lot. So questions? Any questions?
What did you say about the Pauline something or?
Yeah, we use a few words to discuss. So erase that.
And then could you go back about the? You said 7 letters were definitely authentic written by Paul.
Yeah.
And then there were 3 and then 3, but I didn't get.
Yeah, there are 13 letters that are attributed to Paul. 7 of them, scholars completely agree for sure he wrote. I don't know why I wrote Matthew up there. 3 of them are a little bit more debated, and then 3 of them most people think he didn't write, but not all. But let's see, Johannine. So if you see, let's see, misspelling things left and right. These are the words that are generally used for. Do they use C or K? I think I'll use a K. Why not? These are the words that are usually used when talking about the text. So there are letters in the New Testament, one by James, one by Jude, but these are sort of one-offs. When we talk about content by Paul, we usually say the Pauline or Pauline letters or the Pauline corpus. When we talk about things by John, whether it's John the Gospel, there are I believe 3 letters of John, and Revelation. And again, we have this issue of how many Johns are we talking about? There are multiple Johns attested to, but we call them the Johannine literature. Matthean would be things by Matthew, but there's really just the book of Matthew. Now, Lucan material would mean Luke and Acts. Markan material would be, so where we run into these words is when we're talking about if we say Markan material in Luke, right? Because earlier, maybe before you got here, we were talking about how Mark was the first gospel written, and Matthew and Luke both seem to have used Mark in putting together their gospels. And it's possible also that Luke used Matthew, because there's a lot of shared material. There are some people who speculate that Matthew and Luke actually shared a secondary text that they both made use of, and that is called Q, short for Quelle in German, which just means source. So they had another source they used. Some people don't. Q has always only ever been a hypothesis, but people, it was very prevalent for many years. Some more people these days are starting to speculate that maybe Q wasn't a thing. But I mentioned to people earlier before you got here, Deb, that there's a lot of that Luke acknowledges in his gospel that he made use of a lot of different texts. So the Lucan, the Matthean material in Luke, or the Markan material in Luke and Matthew, blah blah blah. These are just the words that you might hear. The Pauline letters, the Johannine literature, blah blah blah. But so it's just Paul, John, Matthew, Luke, Mark. If you hear those words.
So Mark, what I'm reading, it's got M-A-R-C-A-N.
Oh, is it C? Yeah.
C-A-N.
Yeah.
And it's saying that it, Gospels to be written and was used as a source by the other two.
Yeah.
Matthew and Luke.
Yeah. Mark was used by the other two almost without doubt.
Okay.
Yeah. Because they have stuff that's almost it's just verbatim from Mark.
Okay.
And like I said, Luke admits to using different sources to compile his material. The question of whether he and Matthew both used a common source or whether Luke used Matthew as a source is a little bit uncertain. But yeah, there's a lot of this is it's actually called the synoptic problem of just not knowing where they got it. John is left out of that because John's just off doing his own thing. but the synoptic problem is really fundamentally a sourcing problem. It's going, where did they get this? But Mark definitely is the earliest. But none of the Gospels are as early as Paul's letters. So if you were to take the New Testament and say, I'm going to read this chronologically, the 7 uncontested letters of Paul would be where you start. That would be the first thing to read. And then you'd have to start, and then probably, and then the rest of the letters in the New Testament would be a little bit up for debate, because there's a question of whether some of them, the contested letters of Paul and the Johannine letters, whether or not they are written by, whether they're pseudonymous, written by, John or Paul or whatever, or whether they were written by disciples in their in their rabbi's name or in their teacher's name. So that gets a little bit questioned. But then when it comes to the Gospels, Mark is the earliest for sure. And then people have thought Matthew and Luke were around the same time. Some people now think that Luke may have been later, like notably later than Matthew. And then John is almost certainly the latest, probably in the latter 2 decades of the first century. So either in the 80s, 90s. Some people have even said possibly as late as the early decade, the first decade of the second century. But that would make the author, if he was around at the time of Jesus, incredibly old. But he could have been around in the 80s and early 90s if he was a younger contemporary of Jesus, without being. He'd be an old man, but not shockingly old. And he was the early church histories say that John that wrote these things was known to be a very old man, and they clamored begging him to write something down. So, but and some of the early church fathers apparently sat at the feet of this John and learned from him. So, that would be Polycarp and Papias and people who, a little bit of Papias is left, but a letter of Polycarp still exists. So if you
Who's
wanted,
Polycarp?
Polycarp is a disciple of John the Elder. And so, yeah,
And what was the other guy's name?
Papias. He's very interesting. I'm obsessed with Papias. But he wrote 5 books. Papias of Hierapolis, this is unrelated to the material of the Nutu. He compiled, by talking with people, talking with his teacher, talking with other people who knew the disciples or maybe knew Jesus or whatever, he went around and met everybody that he could and tried to collect as many stories, anecdotes, and quotes, etc. as he could. And he compiled 5 books of them, and they're all lost.
Is he in the painting school of Athens?
No, he would. I don't think,
No.
to the best of my knowledge, I don't think he ever went to Greece. He was. I'd have to do some more reading, but I don't think so. He was. Yeah.
It's just when I had taken art history, the name, that's what I think of is that painting.
Okay.
But it's just probably a different name that sounds like him.
It could sound like it. Yeah, this guy. He
He sounds very good.
he's interesting. But there are segments of those 5 books. There are segments. There are a small handful of segments that are super interesting. That are quotes from his collection, but the collection itself is gone. It'd be amazing if a copy was found, but it's just yeah. But yeah. So the New Testament is basically it is the collection of early stuff. There is other early stuff, but it was either the question of how the New Testament canon came to be is it's less, what's the word I'm looking for? Less like shocking than like Dan Brown would have it, or like all those people who like to say they're like it's a conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy at all. But it is interesting if you want to get a little more flavor of the early church. You can look at some of the texts that we do still have of how they were living, the things that they wrote down, that ultimately were not considered authoritative enough by the later church for a variety of reasons. Some of them debatable, like why John but not another text that was really, really popular called the Shepherd of Hermas. Why Revelation but not the Shepherd of Hermas. Even after it fell out of favor and people thought like this is authoritative, even then they said, well, you know what? It's still good use for instruction. So it was still used for many decades after that. But, some of the stuff is, arguable, debatable, and whatever else as they were debating it at the time. But you can still find many of them and read them.
The Shepherd of Paradise.
Hermas, Hermas. Hermas is the author. But so, we can...
H-A-R?
E-R. M-A-S. Yeah. So there's, how the New Testament came to be, what was left out. We can touch on that some more at a later time. But what's in the New Testament and what things came first, that's what it is. And those bullet points of Jesus's life and the beginning of the church itself are all right there. And we'll touch on it a little bit more. I can't remember what next week's is. But anyway, yeah. So, any other questions?
I like your question to consider from last session. This is one of my pet peeves.
What's that? What is
And
it?
it's because I was a history teacher, middle school history teacher for a long time.
Yeah.
If you want a sense of possible future, does considering the past give you a sense of direction? And I found it extremely upsetting when all these statues were taken down. Is because to me, yes, it may be negative, but you need to know the negative so that history does not repeat.
Yeah.
I
Well,
agree.
one of the things there's actually a visual for that idea, and I always think of it. If you want to know the future, if you want to know about the future, like if you say, okay, well, which direction are we heading and which direction are we supposed to be going? Is it this way? Is it this way? Is it that way? Well, if you know this, you can more accurately predict.
Guide yourself, right?
And so I think looking back at the past and looking at how things started and I've always been sort of obsessed with the origins of things. You can get a better sense. Like I wouldn't expect here or here or here to look like this. But if I can track various points, I might get a better general flavor for what kinds of changes are happening, what kinds of things, you might want to expect. And I think that when you look back and you see, somebody made a comment in something that I was listening to. They were like, well, how do you think like the God has changed? You're like, well, does God change? And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that, like, if you look at what the name Israel means, the name Israel means struggles or strives with God, right? And I've thought, like, even if you like, you say, well, ancient Israel, like around the time of, Elijah or whoever, they didn't, I don't believe in that God. I don't believe in whatever. I don't believe in this or that thing that, would call she-bears out to maul a bunch of children, like in the story of Elisha. But like, one of the things, like Greece, what did they do? They did philosophy, and they did very interesting, like, moral framework storytelling and mythology. They really did philosophy. That's what they do. That's what they did. They had everything, from the pre-Socratics down to the Stoics. They wrestled with stuff in their noggin. Confucius, the seriousness with which Confucianism was taken as social structuring and harmony and things like that. They really did social structuring in China. They really did that. That was their thing, and they did that well. Israel and the legacy of Israel is theology. That's what they do. That's what they've done. They haven't always been all of them on board. You have this long history of them, like, not following the Mosaic law. You have sectarian Judaism, but it's always an argument. It's always a fight. It's always a thing, and they're going, no this, back and forth. No. Theology, and that's what they did. And so, yeah, you can look at the story of Abraham and the character of God as they understood. You can look at Moses and the character of God. You can look at the Hebrew prophets and the character of God, and you could look at Jesus and the character of God as presented in this legacy of Israel. And theology is just what they have gifted the world in a way that, like, who buys that Zeus not being able to keep it in his pants is somehow cosmically significant? No one cares. Like, we might take it as a morality tale, but no one really cares that, Zeus or Hera or, any of this. Nobody. And to the degree that, let's say, Hinduism has tons and tons of gods, it's also sort of generally recognized to be highly symbolic of something that actually is far closer to a Trinitarian view, because they have three fundamental ideas at the heart of their concept of the divine, which is Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu. No, sorry, not Vishnu.
No, Vishnu changes too.
Yeah,
From
but
Shiva to Vishnu.
Shiva, Brahma, Shiva, and
The other one.
the other one. There's the creator and the destroyer. Shiva and I can't think of it off the top of my head. But all of this other stuff is manifested conceptually as, like, but it's not the same sort of thing. It's other places. You can find religion in China. You can find religion in this. You can find whatever. But theology in this way is it's kind of an interesting and unique gift from the legacy of Israel. And so this, understanding theologically, you can think you know where you are here, but unless you know something more about these points back here, it's hard to know exactly where you are, much less where you're going.
Yeah, Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu.
It is Vishnu.
It is
Yeah, I don't know why I'm thinking of.
And I thought Vishnu, as I remember, changed into Shiva. I thought that they
I
good
can't
and the
quite
bad,
remember.
the destroyer and
Well, they definitely have, I think, what's the
yin
word?
and yang.
Yeah, there's a kind of a, yeah.
Kind of.
And you know where that comes from, the yin-yang idea. It's not called yin-yang, that's more of a harmonic, like, maybe it's a Taoist
Where's it come
idea.
from?
This picture, this thing, is actually a concept that comes to us from Zoroastrianism. And do you know who
What
it
is
is?
that?
Zoroastrianism is the religion of Persia,
Oh.
which is actually related because Zoroastrianism and Hinduism both trace back to an Indo-European, an Indo-European religion. You can actually see really similar language, in their words for things. It's just that this group made their way from the steppe of the land just sort of north of Persia. They made their way into Persia, and they made their way over into India. But they come from the same tradition. But Zoroastrianism, in fact, the magi that show up at Jesus' birth magi is a Persian word for a priest in Zoroastrianism.
Huh.
So, yeah.
Interesting.
Okay.
Always
Fun stuff.
very informative, thank
Thank
you.
you.
You're welcome.